I'm Christopher C. York, instructor of philosophy at Langara College.
And I'm Zan Plesner. I'm a student at Langara College.
And this is Synthesis and Sophistry.
Today in our recommended reading this season of Synthesis and Sophistry, we're looking at John Stuart Mill's On Liberty of Expression. Zan, you picked this one this week again out of a selection of potential articles. What appealed to you about this particular?
I think freedom of speech is obviously one of the pillars of our society, one of the things that we value a lot. I don't think it's ever a bad idea to go over it again and think clearly about it. I think it's been in the media a lot lately, kind of being misappropriated. So I think, especially nowadays when it has become almost one of these inflaming terms, it's good to talk about it and be clear about it.
Yeah, famously and topically, an instructor at Langara was censured for speaking out at a rally, giving voice to their political views in their spare time, but nevertheless there were professional consequences for their expression.
Yeah, definitely. And I was hoping this was something that we could get into a bit more today, like where the line is between individual free expression versus government suppression of speech and, other entities as well, like where that line is, maybe looking at different cases.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like as long as the threat of institutional reprisal exists, then self-censure is the real threat, right? So you will keep yourself quiet if you think that somebody who's listening is sharpening a knife for you. Yeah. And in today's world, it seems all too obvious that many knives are being sharpened for many targets more or less perpetually. And so that can have a chilling effect on liberal civic discourse, obviously. And this harkens back, John Stuart Mill, famously a utilitarian thinker, this harkens back to an earlier idea of Jeremy Bentham's, right? The panopticon, which was revived by Michel Foucault, right? In looking at how power operates on subjects. So Foucault's reanalysis or reinterpretation of Bentham's panopticon shows that if you think that you are being observed from the central tower, prisoners will mostly take care of their own behavior. They will either govern themselves in such a way that their behavior won't be censured. In other words, they will act as if they are always being watched, even when an observer is absent. So this is a kind of like early version of what we call a chilling effect of online discourse these days.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess before we really get into it, can you just give us John Stuart Mill's sort of thesis for this? It's pretty straightforward, but...
It is, but it's worth repeating for those who found the passage challenging. He's basically arguing that freedom of expression is always a good across the board, with one caveat, right? The caveat being that people can't be harmed. So that's the harm principle, right? That's the limit of free expression. But everything else is supported by Mill as a good for liberal society. Let's talk about the one exception. He gives an example of those damn corn dealers, right? Let's talk about those corn dealers. I'm reading from page 268 in our text. He says, an opinion that corn dealers are starvers of the poor, obviously they were a big problem in Mill's day, or that private property is robbery, ought to be unmolested when simply circulated through the press, but may justly incur punishment when delivered orally to an excited mob assembled before the house of a corn dealer, or when handed about among the same mob in the form of a placard. Acts of whatever kind which, without justifiable cause, do harm to others may be, and in the more important cases absolutely require to be, controlled by the unfavorable sentiments and, when needful, by the active interference of mankind. The liberty of the individual must be thus far limited. He must not make himself a nuisance to other people. And so this harm principle is the justification, for example, of silencing the Langara employee who, for example, sided with the use of violence against actors in the Middle East. So in this case, the harm principle can be, invoked, and you can say, look, even signifying in the slightest that you think that violence is a legitimate tool of political action makes you a radical. It makes you an enemy of civil society, and on that basis, censure is justified. It's like hanging out in front of the corn dealer's house with a placard saying "Death to the corn dealers," right, in Mill's time. I mean, it's different, I suppose, right? So it's analogous in that one sense, right, in that you are condoning violence in some form. Is that different than standing in front of the corn dealer's house with the "Death to the corn dealers" sign? It seems that in one case, your free expression is more likely to cause direct harm to somebody. Say, whereas, a more abstract and physically non-proximal expression of support for a certain tactic or strategy or whatever, less likely to result in direct harm. It's not like yelling fire in a movie theater and people are trampled as a result. Yeah. Right. So it is disanalogous in that way. And so you might say, well, it's harsh to treat the statement as if it were going to have an immediately inflammatory effect and cause, immediate casualties. Now, you might think that any kind of, advocation of violent means are equally condemnable. But I think that might lack nuance, right? For example, going back to World War II, again, since this is philosophy, we often have to go back to World War II as sort of like the greatest expression of human evil, right? So is it wrong to resist Hitler's regime with a clash of arms? Most people would say no, that's a justified war. Hitler is consuming his own civilian population in furnaces, and he's invading peaceful, law-abiding neighboring countries, and on and on and on. Right? There's a justified conflict there, and it seems like if there ever was a war where the use of violence were justified, gosh, isn't it that one? Yeah. Right, and so the point that violence is sometimes needed, that harm necessarily needs to be done occasionally to promote some greater long-term good, I don't know if anybody is against that absolutely across the board. Otherwise, you'd have to go back and say there was no such thing as any just war ever, including the American Civil War that ended slavery. Yeah. Right? And I don't think anybody really wants to say that necessarily. Yeah. That would be absurd, I think.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess, this is why a case-by-case basis is important, I think. You can definitely have some sort of rules that John Stuart Mill gives us here. The direct abdication for violence. I guess the one problem sometimes is that language can be vague. I think, this is why looking at intentions can help out and be important.
But remember, of course, John Stuart Mill, he's a utilitarian. Mm-hmm. And so we're looking at consequences here, right? What are the consequences? In this case, right, the person who is censured is only harming themselves, really. They've done, I guess, probably negligible global harm. they've just destroyed their own career. John Stuart Mill, for his part, thinks that we should be willing to accept the consequences of saying things like this in public. So the fact that, for instance, you have the right to say whatever you want doesn't mean that you are free from reprimand or criticism for saying so. Like, part and parcel of your responsible adult, right to exercise free speech is that you will accept the consequences of what comes from it.
Yeah, that's very true. He does emphasize that, and I think it's important because that's a kind of caricature that you see online sometimes, like, oh, you're trying to censor me, what about free speech? And no one's stopping you from saying this, but you're reaping what you have sown. And yeah,
I'm not trying to necessarily, the critic online isn't necessarily trying to shut anyone up, but more just, draw attention to their wrongness. And maybe, this is what is part and parcel of Mill's account of the goods of public discourse. So the idea that we should let people who are wrong speak freely is part of his account of what makes the freedom of expression important, for a couple of reasons. I'm going to refer you to a quote on page 255 when he talks about constrain the press and its danger in advancing the cause of tyranny. So if you shut the press down, tyranny flourishes, according to Mill. And the power to shut the press down and to cut off freedom of expression, he says, the power itself is illegitimate. The best government has no more title to it than the worst. If all mankind minus one were of one opinion, and only one person were of the contrary opinion, mankind would be no more justified in silencing that one person than he, if he had the power, would be justified in silencing mankind. That's an extreme and an extremely clear advocation for freedom of expression across the board, no matter how unpopular the opinion is. As long as you're not directly harming somebody in saying it, you should be able to say it. And according to Mill, even if it's wrong, the truth will only shine brighter by comparison to it. He thinks that having erroneous opinions expressed publicly sharpens our critical thinking faculties. And we will grow mentally slower. We will basically just repeat slogans and accept dogma unless we actively engage with bad ideas. And sort of like an immune system analogy, right? We can learn how to resist bad ideas through exposure to them.
Yeah. I think we were talking, I'm not sure if on air last week, about movie appreciation and how I've come to become more literate in analyzing movies by watching really bad movies and talking about all the flaws with other people. So when you see something that's done wrong, that gives you a greater scope of the knowledge base and the world around you.
It would be a bad doctor that learned their trade only by studying healthy specimens.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, I guess this passage in Philosophy of Science with Kent Schmore, we read a paper on, it's slipping my mind right now who wrote it, but on the values of the scientific community, and the thing that gives scientific authority its meaning is the fact that people are so able to criticize themselves and criticize other people. There's a organized skepticism in which people put ideas out there and they're constantly criticized. And so you can see the bad ones eventually get flushed out by giving them sunlight, right?
Yeah, if there's no, let's say, free market of ideas, then someone's going to set up a monopoly.
Yeah.
And that's not good for anybody.
Yeah, one thing I found really interesting was he was talking about religion at one point, and talking about how when it becomes a thing that it can no longer be critiqued. It loses its meaning in a way and just becomes dogma. It's not something that people really sit with and think about in a deep way. It's just kind of becomes ideological almost. And I found that really interesting, that it loses its meaning.
Yeah, I mean, it's unless it's constantly, tested and defended, right? According to Mill, and this is on page 267, it becomes a mere formal profession, inefficacious for good, but cumbering the ground and preventing the growth of any real and heartfelt conviction. Mm-hmm. Right, and so that's the living truth, as opposed to some sort of received prepackaged version of it that you don't actually have to engage with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think about teachers I've had in the past, none at Langara, but
of course,
who will just kind of read from the textbook in 1772, and it's just boring. But when you have people who are passionate and thinking about these sort of things and coming at them with a critical lens, it's invigorating and gets you curious about things. I guess one thing with the idea that sunlight is the best disinfectant is nowadays with social media and platforming, I think has become a contentious issue, and one that needs a bit maybe more nuance because of the fact that people can say really inflaming things, and this can be spread to billions of people just by chance of an algorithm liking it or something along those lines. So that person's voice is just amplified 50-fold or 100-fold. So I maybe this is more of a technical problem than a problem for John Stuart Mill, but it's something that I've been thinking about.
So your point is that if you never intended to be heard by 50 million people, but 50 million people end up hearing you and acting on the things that you really never intended to be circulated past a small group of intimate friends, can you be held responsible for what happens as a result?
I guess that's...
What if synthesis and sophistry blows up, goes viral?
Yeah.
And all the stuff that we've been talking about, in this broom closet of an office, right? It's suddenly become historically relevant, right? What then?
I guess I'm thinking more along the lines of another famous paper along this is Henry Frankfurt's on bullshit. There's a lot of bullshit out there nowadays where...
Could you define bullshit in the Frankfurtian sense for the listeners?
Yeah, bullshit is something that is untrue, but not a lie in the traditional sense, because it doesn't care about what the truth is. It kind of tracks what people are talking about, but there's no content behind what they're saying. It's just sort of a way of putting words out there that make people applaud or
saying something about which you know nothing.
Yeah, right? Exactly.
Is bullshit.
That's more concise. But yeah, I guess there's been the proliferation of that on the internet. And so I don't know if sunlight is always the best disinfectant when it's not a lie that's being said, but just bullshit. So it distracts from the topic at hand rather than trying to come to a better understanding of it. It obfuscates the truth.
I think we're mixing up two different issues here. So the freedom of expression doesn't defend my right to shriek over what you're saying, right? So let's say that you and I are having a public debate. If we're protecting each other's freedom of expression, then we take turns. We're respectful of, when someone's said their piece and sort of hands the microphone back and forth to each other. We still follow Robert's rules of order in meetings. We don't just shout over each other, right? There's a protocol there's a sort of understanding in place that allows meaningful conversations to happen and stops the freedom of expression from just being a shouting match. Right. So yes, I defend your right to say whatever you want, so long as you're not interrupting somebody else, right? Just wait your damn turn. I think that's fair to say. And when you're talking about, bullshitters distracting from the point at hand, I feel like if you can establish that something is bullshit, you might just encourage them to stop posting until the people who are actually saying something meaningful are finished.
Yeah.
Or maybe just send them off to another site. Maybe there's I don't know.
Yeah.
There's a different platform for them, right? That they can.
Yeah, I guess this is a different problem than the freedom of expression problem.
Maybe not. Maybe look. You might say, well, my freedom of expression, it's just what I have to say is so urgent and so provocative that I can't wait my turn in line. I have to shout over everybody because no one wants to hear my revolutionary ideas. That's a possible attitude that somebody could take, but I would think it wouldn't be germane to engage with them. It sounds like they're acting beyond the pale of civil society at that point. Yeah.
Yeah, so I guess here, John Stuart Mill, he's not making so much the legal case, but the moral case for freedom of expression.
Yeah,
I'm reading him
he's outlining the moral desirability of allowing freedom of expression. There are benefits that redound to society, right? So you'll hear truths that you wouldn't have heard otherwise if they were suppressed. Maybe partial truths will be given some air to breathe, and we can connect those with other partial truths to come up with fuller pictures of the truth than we would normally be able to if we demanded that only absolutely true things be expressed, right? And again, the whole idea that allowing some amount of bullshit to exist allows us to compare it with true, compelling things that are said and know with all the more surety that those things are more valuable, right? I guess it's like the existence of zirconium makes real diamonds more valuable in some way, right? The fact that you have a fake or a fugazi, right, means that the actual thing retains its value. You can identify the false things, like a jeweler, right? And then the diamonds are all the more valuable. If we are willing to censure anybody, it betrays on our part a presumption of our infallibility. And so long as we accept that we are fallible, to that extent, we should not be willing to censure anybody.
Yeah, it has that sort of arrogance in a way that we think we know best. And like I think you've said a few times, it keeps you honest when you put yourself out to criticism, rather than just hiding behind walls in one sense or another.
Yeah, and that doesn't mean, of course, that we are not free to use our judgment. We can, after hearing somebody out and giving them their fair share of airtime, we can judge that they are full of shit. And we can decide not to listen to any more. And that's fine, as long as we haven't robbed them of their opportunity to say their piece.
One thing he emphasizes is the goods that come from this sort of speech that we have with other people. And it kind of reminded me of like the way that existentialists might view this, and that in order to know ourselves, we need to have a clear vision of ourselves. And so engaging with other people honestly and being open to things we might not like is an important part of that sort of growth and being authentic in the world, rather than hiding behind sanctity or.
Yeah, I think that's a useful connection, and one that, to my knowledge, is not drawn very often between utilitarian and existentialist thinkers. So I do think there is disutility in inauthentic behavior. I think the pretense of unified, let's say, judgment and the pretense of unified belief are not in the interest of any individual in the group. Because we do have differences of opinion, of taste, of thought, and we don't know ourselves fully if we don't feel comfortable expressing those things to each other, and possibly being the target of censure for doing so. Like, that's kind of how we grow and learn, right? That's how we learn our personal qualities and our boundaries, the things that we like and dislike. All this remains unknown if we are afraid to make ourselves known to others. And so, I mean, I think there's a choice here, right? Whether you can live in perpetual, fear of others' judgments, or whether you kind of assume that everything's going to work out basically all right, and you have the faith in other people to talk to them as adults and understand that they might have different ideas than you, and be willing to countenance that, and trusting that they'll be willing to countenance the ideas that you have that might be different than theirs.
Yeah. I was thinking a lot about infantilization from this, right? That's exactly what it is when we think, oh, these ideas are too scary for you. You can't handle it, so I'm not going to bring it up. And yeah, I think it cuts off flourishing for other people. You're less challenged and less able to grow. And sometimes even just saying something really stupid, though it can be painful in the moment, when people call you on it, it helps you to be more careful with your words, I guess, in the future.
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing wrong with using terms precisely and with intention. And there's nothing wrong with being educated as to the harmful effects of expressing yourself in a sloppy or irresponsible way. That's all grist for the mill, right? My worry and Mill's worry is that paralysis can be the likely outcome of getting too far in your head about whether everything you say has some sort of consequence. And I feel like, acting like other people are made out of glass or they'll shatter if you say the wrong thing. It's bad for philosophy especially, right? Any sort of really meaningful philosophical discourse will have the potential to rub somebody the wrong way. And my concern is that eventually the discipline will have this, yellow tape around it, and around the entire subject of philosophy, there'll be this trigger warning tape, right? And it'll be something that, people who, might otherwise benefit from engaging in this discourse might be dissuaded from doing so because they might have this self-image or this wrong idea, I think, about the world that the only way to get by is by hiding your opinions, hiding your beliefs, not saying what's on your mind, and just like getting by. Yeah. And I feel like that leads to a worse life for almost everybody if we just, do that.
Yeah, I think this is why responsible communication is a two-way street, I think. Being charitable to what people are saying, not trying to just find the worst possible interpretation is really important. I think that, that takes a level of maturity. And I think it's also, on the person to understand that words have power as well. And, again, it's a two-way street. And I think just having that respect for other people and yourself as well, that's something that we could use more of, I think, nowadays.
But those corn dealers, Zan, they got me so worked up. They're the starvers of the people. What's going to be done about the corn dealers?
Yeah.
Gosh, they get me hot under the collar.
Yeah, I guess in that situation, maybe maybe don't say death to corn dealers, but hey, you guys, cut it out.
Yeah, stop starving people.
Yeah.
Corn dealers.
Yeah.
So we want to avoid infantilization. We want to avoid passivity. So it sounds to me like you're more or less in line with Mill and you support his thesis for the freedom of speech.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's foundational for a reason. I think it's one of the best things that modern culture has produced. There's been a lot of times in history where there's not been freedom of speech, and there's a whole host of bad outcomes that come from that. And I think it, like we've touched upon a few times, it cuts off possible flourishing of ideas and people in general. I think, going back to Harry Frankfurt, just having proper true knowledge in our world is an existential good. It helps us know, it helps us navigate the world in a meaningful and productive way. And when that is obfuscated in any way, that's a worse state of affairs, I think.
Well, let me ask you some challenging questions then, Zan.
Uh-oh.
So do you agree with Mill that the harm principle is the logical limit of the freedom of expression?
Yeah, I do.
All right, then.
But
do you, to cut you off, do you think that emotional harm should be covered by the harm principle?
I think this is a case-by-case basis. I do think there's limits, but we should try and put those limits as far as we possibly can. But there's always going to be a case, I think.
You got a new haircut.
I got a new haircut.
What if I said something mean about your haircut?
That's fine.
I mean, I think, as a matter of fact, I think it's a lovely haircut.
Oh, thank you.
But what if I remarked on it and I said something not to that effect?
Yeah, no, I think that's fine, and trying to shut that down would be ridiculous. And I think there's, again, we should try to be charitable and,
So slam comedians, or the so-called Don Rickles. What was he?
Oh yeah.
Insult comedians.
Yeah.
We should tolerate those.
Oh, we should have more of them. I love insult comics. I guess the limit might be saying really terrible and harmful things about people's race or, identity, I guess, that when they're marginalized groups and there's been a history of violence towards them, especially if you're saying, I'm going to do A, B, and C, I think
that's making a direct threat of harm, right?
Okay, yeah.
So that's covered. Like saying that you're going to kill somebody is as illegal as trying to kill somebody. So that's covered already by the law. What's maybe more nebulous, right, is expressing some ignorant or prejudiced opinion, right, which can be harmful, and it can presumably lead to lasting mental states that people suffer from, like a sense of oppression or inferiority or whatever people take on from that, right, I think qualifies as a harm. Now, if it's not likely to result in that, and again, this is where the line gets a little bit blurry, right? Because then how do you distinguish a really damaging, emotionally scarring remark from what you think is an off-the-cuff comedic insult, a la Don Rickles, right? And of course, the history of comedy, there's lots of comedians who cover material which, is racist, sexist, anti-gay, whatever, that runs the gamut. Should we get those people off the stage?
Yeah, no. I guess that I wasn't fully appreciating the distinction between like threats or hate speech in that sort of way and emotional harms. I could be convinced otherwise, but I'd say there's almost no situation in which we should at least legally limit speech that could be seen as emotionally harmful. But I totally think that comedians who say just regressive bullshit are free to lose audiences.
Right, and that's the penalty, right? That Mill says awaits people who do this kind of thing, right? So let's say that you have some sort of illiberal belief system, which is bound to alienate people and get you in hot water. You have to be ready for that when you open your mouth to say these things, right? And if you don't, then it's your own hubris or foolishness that will trip you up.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. I guess we've seen that play out with certain people. I guess again, this is where the charity might come in, right? Sometimes people just do say horrible things and then regret it afterwards. And I think as long as they're earnest in apologizing and actually showing that they understand why people were upset. They don't have to do that in every case, but there are some cases where they do that, and I think that we need to be more willing to let those people come back into the loving arms of the public.
So you're saying forgive Louis C.K.?
I'm not.
Is that what you're saying?
I don't know enough about that case.
He masturbated in front of female comedians.
Okay.
Allegedly.
Allegedly. Okay.
I think he actually admitted it, so it's not just alleged. Admittedly.
Yeah, I'm aware of that, but I think we were talking with a fellow student about it, and she maybe had. I thought I understood it, and she had a much more nuanced view than I did. So I think in order for me to have a strong opinion, I would need to look into it a bit more.
Yeah. Don't look too far into it. Now, here's the other side of it, right? So you and I, we're both liberal fellows. We recognize the harm principle as a logical limit of the freedom of expression. However, there's a sort of relatively modern phenomenon, not unlike the phenomenon of soccer players dropping to the field and pretending to be injured in order for a penalty card to be, raised by the referee against the opposing team. We have moral outrage, right, in today's society, wherein even if you're not suffering any subjective emotional harm, you will nevertheless be aggrieved at somebody else's free expression. And it's almost like there's a certain subsection of the population that takes a certain perverse joy in nailing people for these emotional fouls, even when they themselves don't feel anything at all. Yeah. And so this is the danger, I suppose, that oversubscribing to the harm principle, right, leaves us vulnerable to. What do you say about this? What do you say about moral outrage as a sort of contemporary social phenomenon?
Yeah, that's why I think the emotional harm, we should, we should be a lot more lenient with it. I think there's very few cases that you could show that it's justified to limit the free speech of someone because what they're saying is inflaming. Again, like this.
I think the worst parts of us kind of get the phenomenon. Oh, I can't believe she said that. It's a bit like, it's an easy win. Mm-hmm. It's kind of pathetic, but you can understand the psychology of it.
Yeah, and I think sometimes too, like when people are very invested in causes and someone says something that's ignorant and purposely inflaming, I get that emotional reaction, but it's one of those things, I guess, where it's you can behave more or less virtuously in that situation, and it would be more virtuous to try and interpret it in a charitable way, or just try to understand how they got there.
Some people are just ignorant about certain issues or causes, and they're speaking to the best of their ability, but their ability to express themselves is limited for whatever reason. And Obviously, you're not obliged to agree with an ignorant person, but maybe it wouldn't hurt to try to understand why it is they're saying these things that strike you as, let's say, disagreeable. And I think that kind of mature approach to communication is required for liberal society to thrive. Again, the active application of the principle of charity to not only philosophical, discussion or classrooms, but to our day-to-day interactions. I think it's becoming more and more important in contemporary discourse of all kinds.
Yeah, totally. And I really get the impulse of like certain people, when they say horrible things against vulnerable groups, to really want to go after that person. I think sometimes that can be justified, but I think just maybe it's one of those things where before you write out that tweet or whatever, just take a breath and kind of think about your intentions. There might be a helpful thing that people could do to act in a more mature way or more thoughtful way.
Yeah, I mean, here's something, I guess, that's more in the field of sociology than philosophy, but I do feel like, especially for young males, taunting the bull is an important part of their identity formation. And so, like, saying something controversial online and seeing what happens, it's a bit like they might not actually be committed to the things that they're saying. They just want the attention, negative or positive, and they want the feeling of pushing up against some other force and expressing themselves or exerting themselves. And, in my day and age, this was part and parcel of growing up, and it probably still is. But the difficult thing is that with the sort of unique technological reach of the spoken and written word in our time, people's ordinary rites of passage into adulthood can be referenced from here until eternity. And so if they say something foolish in the process of defining who they are or sorting that out, the effects can haunt them and have unintended knock-on effects for other people too. So what am I going for here with this line of thought? Am I saying that we should have a license to use the internet that we should only hand over to 18-year-olds?
I mean,
you can put your I'm 18. I can put my first post on X. Wow, yeah. Or what we still call Twitter.
Yeah. I refuse to call it X.
Yeah, fair enough.
Yeah, I mean, I like the idea of not ever having to interact with 15-year-olds online again, but I could see some maybe
that might be triggering for some of our audience. All those 15-year-old boys that are listening out there.
Oh yeah,
Zan will give a written apology.
I was one too. I was worse than any one of them, I'm sure.
Wow.
But
I'm gonna Google you when this is done.
Please don't. The podcast will be over.
No,
no, it's not. This is not that bad. It's just cringe. It's all cringe.
This is not the way that I should have gone into this enterprise. I should have vetted you more carefully.
Are you trying to limit my speech?
Oh no, of course not.
I guess. One thing that comes up a lot nowadays when it comes to free speech is the sort of platforming people. And I find myself curious about this. Like, I do think, again, maybe there's certain times when platforming is inappropriate.
So by platforming, you mean? We define our terms, of course.
Yeah, platforming, bringing someone onto a forum of some kind with a large audience where they can express their views and ideas.
Like when we had Tamira as our guest, we platformed her.
Yeah. I think that's a good case of platforming, though. I think that's a social good. But I do think that there's certain cases like Joe Rogan during the pandemic platforming certain pseudoscientists has created a huge amount of harm. And I think legally, of course, he should be able to do that. But morally, I think that was wrong to do that.
Right. So you say maybe it's irresponsible of him, or it had some sort of negative consequences.
Yeah.
Likely probably from his platforming these people, especially in the time of a health crisis.
Yeah, muddying the waters while everyone's just trying to figure out what's going on. I think it was irresponsible. And again, I don't know if censorship was the right thing to do there. But
you're calling him out, at least.
Yeah.
You're not saying deplatform Rogan. You're saying that in this particular instance, he behaved in a morally problematic manner. And I think that, both what he's doing and what you're doing are defensible acts of free speech, right? Now, let's say that, things turn out differently. Let's say that Joe Rogan's podcast were so influential that the pandemic of COVID never abated in the United States, and it completely destroyed the U.S. economy. And as a result, Canada's political stability were threatened. You could make a case, right, that the harm principle ought to have been evoked, and they ought to have taken Joe Rogan off the air well before that happened. I do think, though, right, we have a tendency to put the tempests in the teapots. And I think that, there's a lot of, free expression that can be tolerated before anything really bad happens. I mean, ideally, when you're speaking to an audience of relatively well-calibrated adult minds, they will weigh it up for themselves. And I'm sure that some people probably listen to the Joe Rogan podcast during the pandemic as a form of entertainment or relief from the stresses of COVID, right? They might just see it as a clown show, or like, wow, check out this nut who's a COVID denier, or whatever, right? I'm not saying I didn't listen to the podcasts in question, so I can't say, but I'm saying that's a potential response that a hypothetical person could have to such a podcast. In which case, no harm done. But again, we judge by its effects, and this is sort of the famous problem with utilitarianism in general, is that sometimes we are very bad judges of the consequences of our actions. So that's the issue with utilitarianism, right? And deciding ahead of time what the right course of action is means that we have a accurate understanding of the likely outcomes of our actions. And what you're pointing out with your focusing on the social media technology of our day is it's becoming increasingly unpredictable what our words and actions will reap in the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. I guess part of that is maybe just being more intentional with how you.
There's a knob there, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, again, there's a sort of dampening knob. You're saying, let's be more careful and intentional. The more that we crank the knob towards caution and intention, we have that dampening effect on public discourse.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
We don't want to crank it all the way up to irresponsible forms of speech like hate speech, but we also don't want to have crickets on the radio, for example. We want to have a lively exchange of ideas. And, to do that, we have to keep the knob somewhere in the middle.
Yeah. I guess being absolutist either way is probably a bad idea when it comes to these sort of principles. But
my father had an expression that he used to tell me. He said, better to... what was it exactly? Gosh, I got to recall this now. He said, better to be quiet and be thought of as a fool than to open your mouth and confirm it. This was a bit of fatherly wisdom that he imparted. Obviously, I didn't take his advice.
You are podcasting.
Yes, in defiance of my father. Yeah. Take that, Dad. I've got a podcast. No, but I mean, when I listened to that when I was growing up, like I thought to myself, well, that's kind of cowardly. Right? And if you take that kind of stance where you're just always the strong silent type and you never speak up about anything, I mean, it seems very likely that you will never find the words to express your beliefs. You will never take a stand for anything that you believe in because you'll never bother expressing it. Yeah. Which might make you sexy and attractive to ladies who like the strong silent type, but it's not going to make you, it's no good if you have the intention of becoming, and I'm not saying I have this intention, but if you intend on becoming, a public intellectual, for example, and you're interviewed, you're saying, well, I have no comment. Yeah. No comment. Yeah. It's not very helpful or enlightening. There has to be somebody who's willing to kick the ball forward in human civilization. Not everybody can just be appear wise and quiet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel like also, you're just not testing yourself against other people in any sort of meaningful way. So it's kind of just like the guy who plays basketball in his driveway by himself all day. That's boring.
And who thinks he could be Michael Jordan.
Yeah.
Michael Jordan's not that good.
Yeah, look at me.
Yeah, look at me, another three-pointer.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So, that shows when I was aware of basketball. That comment ages me.
Yeah, well, that's
Kobe
probably
Bryant.
Oh, there you go.
More topical.
I'm not a huge sports guy myself, so that's probably the reference I would go for.
There you go.
Mike Tyson.
Sure. I mean, the classics, right?
Yeah, exactly. All right.
Wayne Gretzky.
Yeah.
You can't go wrong.
Yeah, exactly. It's like I'm a bit of a music aficionado. So
okay.
I feel like I'm the guy who's like with sports, when people are like, oh yeah, you ever listen to Led Zeppelin? They're pretty good. I'm like, yeah, man, it's day one. Come on.
So basic.
Yeah. But I do love Led Zeppelin.
Yeah, me too. We have that in common. We're just if we never talked about Led Zeppelin, we would never have discovered this commonality between us.
There you go.
And so there's a new sort of unity that's developing here. Our appreciation of Led Zeppelin.
We have a prerogative to speak up.
We do.
All right. Well, thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Sam.